Does a divine whisper ever pierce the clamor of your existence, drawing you toward a path shrouded in shadows where the unknown looms like a silent specter? What if the man hailed as the father of faith was once a soul trembling under the weight of doubt, his heart a battlefield of fear and longing? Can a heart that stumbles in the dust of fire still be chosen to weave a legacy that echoes beyond the grave? A testament to grace that defies time. Why does the Almighty summon us to forsake all we hold dear, only to veil the journey in a mist of mystery that tests the soul's endurance? Is the road to His promises forged not in the clarity of certainty, but in the crucible of surrender? Silence, an unseen hope that challenges the spirit. These questions hover like mist over a desolate plain, their echoes stirring the air with a haunting resonance, beckoning us into the life of a man named Abraham. His tale is no gilded myth spun by poets in the glow of firelight. It is a sacred unveiling, a mirror of human frailty touched by divine fire, a story carved in the sands of time, etched with the tears of struggle and the light of faith. In the ancient city of Ur, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their serpentine paths through the fertile land, Abram dwelt amid a world alive with sound, shadow, and sacred tension that pulsed through the streets. The air thrummed with the cries of merchants bartering silks and spices, their voices rising like a tide beneath the amber glow of torches that flickered against the encroaching night, casting dancing shadows on the mud brick walls that stood as silent witnesses. Priests chanted to idols of clay and starlight, their hymns a rhythmic drone that echoed off the stone, where the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the musk of livestock and the sharp, resinous tang of myrrh burning in offering bowls, a fragrance that filled the senses. The ziggurats towered, their stepped heights piercing a sky that offered no answer, no solace, their stone surfaces cold and unyielding under the moon's pale gaze, a silent testament to human striving against the infinite. The air was thick, heavy with dust and incense, a blend that clung to the skin and weighed upon the spirit, a reminder of a world vibrant yet hollow, a place where gods of stone held sway over the hearts of men. In this crucible of life, Abram's heart stirred, restless, as if an unseen hand pressed against his soul, whispering of a destiny beyond the city's embrace, a call that stirred the depths of his being with a longing he could not name, a yearning that burned like a hidden flame. What stirs within you when the cones of this world fall silent, when the familiar becomes a chain that binds the spirit, a prison of comfort that stifles the soul's cry? The call came like a thunderclap in the stillness, as divine summons often do, breaking the monotony of daily life with a voice that resonated through his bones, a sound that shook the foundations of his world and stirred the depths of his heart. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household, the Lord commanded, to the land I will show you. Genesis 12:1. No map unfurled before Abram's eyes to guide his uncertain steps through the wilderness ahead. No chart to light the way. No promise of riches or safety softened the decree. No vision of green fields or flowing rivers eased the burden of leaving all he knew. No assurance to quiet his fears. Only a voice, vast as the heavens, yet tender as a breath against his ear, demanded his obedience, a call that pierced the noise of Ur's markets and reached into the silence of his soul. To leave Ur was to sever the cords that bound him family, heritage, the rhythms of a life carved into the city's stones, the laughter of kin, the warmth of a hearth, the security of a known path, the comfort of a predictable dawn, the weight of the call pressed against his chest. Each heartbeat a silent question: could he trust a God unseen? A presence felt but not beheld in the flesh, a mystery beyond comprehension. Would the promise hold when the path grew desolate, when the sands stretched endless before him? A sea of uncertainty that swallowed the light of the past. The marketplace's clamor faded as he stood at Ur's edge, the desert stretching before him like an uncharted sea, its waves of sand whispering of trials to come, a vast expanse that beckoned with both promise and peril. The night was cool, the sands of the desert shimmering under a moon that hung low, casting silver veins across the dunes that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light, a celestial dance of hope and mystery that lit the darkness. The wind carried a low, mournful wail, like the sigh of forgotten spirits drifting through the ages. A sound that stirred the soul with both fear and awe, a lament for what was left behind. A cry of the past, the air tasted of salt and ancient earth, a flavor that lingered on the tongue, a testament to the land's timeless endurance, a taste of the eternal amid the temporal, a hint of the divine. Abram's sandals sank into the ground, each step a surrender to the unknown, a quiet act of faith that echoed in the stillness, a footprint in the sand of obedience, a mark of trust. Sarai walked beside him, her silence a reflection of his own uncertainties, her presence a steady flame in the gathering dark, her footsteps soft against the sand, a companion in the journey of the soul, a partner in the pilgrimage. The creak of wooden carts and the soft bleating of goats filled the air, grounding the moment in the ordinary. Yet the heavens seemed to lean close, their stars burning with a clarity that pierced the soul, as if they bore witness to a man's trembling choice to follow a voice he could not see, a decision that would shape the ages, a leap into the eternal. The scriptures whisper, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding," Proverbs 3:5. Yet how often do we cling to the safety of the known, fearing the cost of a single step into the void, the price of leaving behind all that we have known, the risk of trusting an unseen hand, the burden of faith. Abram's journey was no triumphant march, no procession of glory under banners of victory, no parade of human triumph that echoed through the land. His steps were heavy, laden with the grief of leaving the familiar, the voices of his father's house, the scent of home-cooked meals, the security of a life well-trodden, and the fear of what lay ahead. A future shrouded in mist, a path unwritten, a road of shadows. The desert was a vast crucible, its sands swallowing the echoes of Ur's vibrancy, its silence a mirror to his soul, reflecting both his hope and his doubt in equal measure. A duality of light and dark. The sun beat down by day, its heat a relentless weight that seared the skin, a fire that tested the resolve, a trial of endurance that burned away the weak, while the nights brought a chill that seeped into the bones, a cold that reminded him of the fragility of life in this unforgiving land, a whisper of mortality that haunted his dreams. The scent of sagebrush and dry earth clung to the air, a testament to the land's indifference to human hopes, a fragrance that spoke of endurance amid desolation, a perfume of perseverance that lingered in the nostrils. Each mile stretched the distance between the known and the unknown, and with it, the questions grew louder, their voices rising like a chorus in his mind, a symphony of doubt that played in the silence. Had he heard the voice aright, or was it a delusion born of longing, a mirage in the desert that deceived the eye? Was this God truly faithful, or would he be abandoned to the wilderness, left to wander without guide? A soul adrift, the desert offered no answers, only its endless expanse, a canvas where doubt painted its shadows with bold strokes, a gallery of fear and faith intertwined, a battleground of the spirit where hope and despair clashed. Yet in the midst of doubt, Abram raised altars, monuments of trust amid the desolation, pillars of faith in a land of uncertainty, beacons of hope in the wilderness. At Shechem, where ancient oaks stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches whispering secrets older than time, their leaves rustling with the wisdom of ages. A chorus of nature's memory that spoke of endurance. He piled stones beneath a foreign sky that stretched one and uncharted. A vast canopy of stars that glimmered with promise. The air was thick with the scent of resin and freshly turned earth. A fragrance that rose like an offering to the heavens. The leaves rustling like a chorus of unseen voices carried on the breeze. A hymn of hope in the wilderness. A song of the soul that rose above the silence. As he knelt, the ground pressed cool and firm against his knees, grounding him in a promise he could not yet grasp, a vow that seemed to hover just beyond his reach, a dream deferred that tested his faith. To your offspring I will give this land. The Lord had said, Genesis 12:7, the words hanging heavy in the air, a future beyond his vision, a whisper of hope amid the silence, a light in the darkness that guided his hands. His hands trembled as he arranged the stones, each one a fragile act of trust, a declaration that God's voice was stronger than his fears, a beacon in the gathering dark, a light to guide him through the night, a foundation for a nation yet to be, a cornerstone of covenant. What altars do you build when the promises of God seem distant? When faith feels like grasping at the edge of a dream, a fleeting shadow in the dusk, a hope that fades with the setting sun, a whisper lost in the wind. The land of promise was not a haven of immediate abundance, a paradise where milk and honey flowed without effort, a garden of ease where trials were unknown. Famine struck Canaan, its fields withered under a merciless sun that scorched the earth to ash, leaving behind a landscape of desolation, a wasteland of broken dreams that stretched to the horizon. The streams that once sang through the valleys fell silent, their beds cracked and dry, their waters a memory swallowed by dust. A lament for what once was, a dirge for lost abundance that echoed in the stillness. The air carried the faint scent of decay and parched soil, a cruel reminder that divine promises do not shield us from the trials of this world, that the path of faith is often lined with thorns, a road of suffering that tests the heart. Hunger gnawed at Abram's household, each empty bowl a silent accusation against the call, each hollow glance a question of God's faithfulness, a doubt that whispered in the stillness, a shadow on the heart that darkened his spirit. In desperation, he turned toward Egypt, a land of plenty but also of peril, its green fields a mirage on the horizon, a temptation to stray from the divine path, a lure of human strength that beckoned with false hope. The decision was a detour, born not of faith but of fear, a human attempt to secure survival when the spirit wavered, when the promise seemed a distant echo, a voice lost in the wind, a call unanswered. Egypt's grandeur was a stark contrast to the desert's austerity, a vision of life amid the wasteland, a beacon of human achievement that dazzled the eye. The Nile's waters shimmered under the sun, their surface alive with the reflection of palm fronds and lotus blooms. A dance of color against the blue, a symphony of nature's bounty that sang of abundance. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and burning incense. The streets alive with the chatter of traders and the clink of gold against stone. A melody of wealth and power. A hymn to human endeavor that filled the ears. Yet beneath the opulence lay danger. A shadow that loomed over Abram's heart. A threat that stirred his fear. A specter of death that haunted his steps. Gazing upon Sarai's beauty, he foresaw peril, a sword hanging over his life, a blade of uncertainty that threatened his peace. "Say you are my sister," he urged, "so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared." Genesis 12:13. The lie was a shield, a fragile barrier against death, but it was also a betrayal of Sarai, of truth, of the God who had called him forth from Ur's safety, a denial of the covenant. The palace of Pharaoh swallowed Sarai, its halls echoing with the laughter of courtiers and the clink of goblets, the air thick with myrrh and sandalwood, masking the bitterness of Abram's compromise, a fragrance that cloaked his shame, a veil over his guilt. Yet his heart knew the margin, a weight that pressed heavier than the desert sands, a burden that gnawed at his spirit, a wound that bled in silence, a scar upon his soul. The psalmist sings, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18, "When have you compromised in fear, only to find God's mercy waiting to lift you from the ashes, to restore what was lost, to heal the hidden scars, to bind up the broken?" God's faithfulness did not falter, a rock unmovable amid the storm, a foundation that stood firm against the tide. Plagues fell upon Pharaoh's house, a divine hand that exposed the law and returned Sarai to Abram's side, a deliverance born of grace, a redemption unearned, a gift of love. The rebuke from a pagan king burned in his soul, a searing reminder that the man called by God was not immune to frailty, that even the chosen stumble, that the path of faith is strewn with falls, a road of humility, chastened. Abram returned to Canaan, the desert welcoming him back with its familiar winds, now carrying the faint scent of rain, a whisper of renewal amid the dust, a promise of life in the wasteland, a breath of hope that stirred the air. He pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai, where the hills rose like ancient guardians, their slopes cloaked in olive groves that swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves a green testament to endurance, a symbol of peace that spoke of resilience. The stars above burned brighter, as if to reaffirm the promise, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, Genesis 12:2, a vow that echoed through the night, a light in the darkness that guided his path. Yet the years stretched on, and Sarai's womb remained empty, a silent wound that deepened with each passing season, a quiet ache that reverberated through their tent, a sorrow that weighed upon their hearts, a burden shared in silence. The silence of childlessness was a shadow that lingered, a quiet ache that echoed through the fabric of their lives, a thread of pain in the tapestry of faith, a wound that refused to heal. The desert nights were cool, the air heavy with the scent of cedar smoke drifting from distant fires, a faint comfort against the vastness, a reminder of human presence amid the wild, a flicker of warmth that pierced the cold. Abram sat beneath the stars, their countless points of light a mockery of his barren hope, each twinkling orb a question unanswered, a challenge to his faith, a riddle in the night that tested his resolve. The silence was broken only by the rustle of tent flaps and the distant howl of a jackal, its cry a lament carried on the wind, a sound that pierced the stillness, a wail of the wilderness that spoke of loneliness. The weight of unfulfilled promises pressed against him, heavier than any famine, more relentless than any storm, a burden that tested the marrow of his faith, that pushed him to the edge of despair, a trial of the spirit that shook his foundation. Have you ever waited so long for a promise that hope began to feel like a wound, a scar upon the soul, a pain that lingers in the quiet, a burden that bends the back, a weight that crushes the spirit? The Lord spoke again, piercing the silence with a voice that shook the earth, a sound that reverberated through the desert night, a thunder of divine intent that stirred the air. Do not be afraid. From I am your shield, your very great reward. Genesis 15:1. The words were a balm to his weary spirit, a soothing touch upon a heart worn thin. Yet they stirred a deeper ache, a longing that refused to be silenced, a cry that rose from the depths, a plea from the abyss that sought the divine ear. Sovereign Lord, Abram replied, what can you give me since I remain childless? Genesis 15:2. The question was raw, the cry of a heart stretched thin by delay, a plea born not of defiance but of desperation, a soul laid bare before the throne, a confession of need that poured from his lips. God did not rebuke him. Instead, he led Abram outside, under the canopy of stars that stretched across the heavens like a tapestry of divine intent, their light a silent witness to the promise, a constellation of hope that glimmered in the dark. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. Genesis 15:5. The promise was not new, but its repetition was a lifeline, a reminder that God's word does not fade with the turning of seasons, that it endures beyond the frailty of man, a rock in the storm, an anchor in the flood. Abram believed, and the scriptures declare Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6. Faith, in that moment, was not certainty but choice, a decision to cling to God's voice over the evidence of an empty womb, a choice to trust when the heart quaked, when the body aged, when the world offered no proof, a leap into the unknown that defied reason. Yet faith, though credited, was not perfected, a diamond still in the rough, a work in progress that required refinement. The waiting continued, and with it, the temptation to forge human solutions, to take the reins from the divine hand, to shape the future with mortal hands that faltered. Sarai, weary of barrenness, her spirit worn by the years, her eyes shadowed with unfulfilled longing, offered her servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her, she said. Genesis 16:2. Her voice heavy with the weight of a dream deferred, a hope deferred that maketh the heart sick, a burden shared. The plan was rooted in custom, a practice of the age, but it was a departure from trust, a step into the realm of human will, a grasping at control, a bid for power that sought to usurp the divine. Abram agreed, and Hagar conceived. But the result was not joy. Jealousy and division tore through the household like a storm, a tempest of bitterness and strife, a whirlwind of human failing that shattered peace. And Hagar fled into the desert, pregnant and alone, her footsteps swallowed by the sand, her cries lost in the wind, a solitary figure in the waste. The Lord found Hagar by a spring, where the water shimmered under a relentless sun, a fragile oasis in the arid waste, a glimmer of life amid desolation, a drop of mercy in the desert that refreshed the soul. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, a fleeting relief that mingled with the bitterness of her tears, a fragrance of hope amid despair, a whisper of grace that soothed the heart. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? The Lord asked, Genesis 16:8. His voice a gentle probe into her brokenness, a call to face the path ahead with courage, a summons to turn her heart toward the divine, a light in the darkness. The question was for her awakening, not his knowledge, a beacon to guide her steps, a hand to lift her up from the dust. He promised her son, Ishmael, would become a nation, a testament to God's hearing, a name that meant God hears, a promise of life that echoed in the silence. But he also called her to return to Sarai's tent, to face the consequences with grace, to walk in obedience amid the storm. God's mercy redeems broken places, even when the consequences of human choice linger like shadows. A stain upon the soul, a mark of the fall that lingers in the memory. For Abram and Sarai, Ishmael's birth was a painful lesson. Human efforts cannot birth the divine promise. They can only distort its fulfillment, a mirror of their own frailty, a reflection of their need, a call to repentance. The Apostle Paul reflects, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, Colossians 3:23. How often do we labor for God's promises with human hands, only to find His grace weaving redemption from the wreckage, a tapestry of mercy amid our mistakes, a garment of light in the darkness, a robe of righteousness. The years pressed on, each one a silent test of endurance, a refining fire that shaped the soul, a furnace that burned away the dross, a purification of the spirit that cleansed the heart. Abram was 99, his body worn by time, his hair silvered by the desert winds, his face etched with the lines of a life lived in faith and fear, a map of trials endured, a chronicle of grace. His hope was weathered but not extinguished, a flame that flickered yet endured, a light that refused to die, an ember that glowed in the night. The desert had become his home, its harsh beauty a mirror of his journey, its sands a canvas for the Almighty's work, a testament to the trials that forge a man, a sculptor's chisel on the soul, a potter's hand on the clay. The scent of sagebrush and dry earth filled the air as he sat outside his tent. The stars above a constant reminder of God's word, their light a silent promise against the darkness, a beacon in the night, a guide through the storm, a star to steer by. The silence of the night was broken by a presence, a voice that shook the soul with its power, a sound that reverberated through the stillness, a thunder of divine intent that stirred the air with awe. I am God Almighty, walk before me mighty faithfully and be blameless. The Lord declared, Genesis 17:1. The words were not a rebuke but an invitation, a call to deeper surrender, a summons to live not by sight but by the covenant etched upon his heart, a bond that transcended human failing, a promise that endured, a vow that stood firm. God renewed the covenant, a sacred bond that stood firm amid the shifting sands of time, a rock in the tempest, an anchor in the flood. He changed Abram's name to Abraham, father of many nations, Genesis 17:5, and Sarai's to Sarah, princess, Genesis 17:15. The change was no mere utterance, it was a declaration of destiny, a divine act of naming what was not yet seen, a whisper of hope amid the silence, a promise spoken into the void, a word that created life from barrenness. Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. God promised, Genesis 17:19, the name meaning laughter, a prophecy of joy to come, a sound that would rise from the ashes of despair, a melody of grace that filled the air. Abraham laughed, not in mockery but in wonder. His heart caught between the weight of years and the audacity of faith, a soul suspended between doubt and hope, a man on the threshold of miracle. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old, he asked, Genesis 17:17. His voice trembling with awe and lingering doubt, a question that hung in the air like a prayer, a cry to the heavens that sought answer. Yet God's word was unshaken. A pillar of truth in the shifting sands, Isaac would be born, transforming the laughter of disbelief into the laughter of fulfillment, a song of redemption that echoed through the ages. The scriptures teach, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise. As some understand slowness, instead he is patient with you, 2 Peter 3:9. Where have you doubted God's timing? Only to find his patience shaping a greater purpose, a plan that unfolds in the fullness of time, a design beyond human sight, a work of divine art. Abraham's faith was not a solitary flame. It was a light meant to illumine others, a beacon to guide the lost, a lamp in the darkness that shone with hope. When 3 visitors arrived at his tent in Mamre, he welcomed them with urgency, his heart unaware that one was the Lord himself, cloaked in human form, a mystery veiled in flesh, a presence divine yet hidden, a paradox of grace. The air was heavy with the scent of baked bread and roasted meat, the heat of the day softened by the shade of ancient oaks whose branches swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves a green canopy against the sun, a shelter from the storm that offered respite. The ground was warm beneath his feet, the earth itself seeming to hum with the weight of the moment, as if creation held its breath, awaiting the divine word, a pause in the rhythm of time, a moment of eternity. Their words pierced the ordinary demur. Sarah, your wife, will have a son, Genesis 18:10. A promise that broke the silence of years, a word that shattered the stillness, a declaration that changed the course. Sarah, listening behind the tent flap, her form hidden in the shadows, laughed not in joy, but in the bitter ache of a barren heart worn thin by time, a wound that bled in secret, a pain that lingered. After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure, Genesis 18:12. Her voice a whisper of cynicism born from pain, a cry that rose from the depths of her soul, a lament of the flesh that sought relief. The Lord heard her laugh, not with human ears, but with divine perception that sees beyond the flesh, that pierces the veil of the heart, that knows the hidden places where doubt resides. Why did Sarah laugh, he asked, his voice a gentle challenge, a call to confront the doubt within, a summons to faith that lifted her gaze. Is anything too hard for the Lord, Genesis 18:14? The question was a beacon, illuminating the chasm between human frailty and divine power, a light that dispelled the shadows of despair, a ray of hope in the night that pierced the gloom. Sarah's laugh was not her end, it was her beginning. A crack in the armor of unbelief through which hope would flow, a river of grace in the desert, a stream in the wasteland that refreshed the weary. The desert, with its endless sands and fleeting shadows, bore witness to this truth: nothing is too hard for the Lord, no heart too broken, no promise too distant, no soul too lost. The scent of oak and dust lingered, as if the earth itself paused, waiting for faith to rise from the ashes of doubt, for trust to bloom in the barrenness, for life to spring from the dry ground, for hope to dawn. What promise have you laughed at, fearing it is too late, too impossible for the Almighty to fulfill? A dream that seems lost to the winds, a hope that fades with the dawn, a vision that eludes the grasp. The journey of faith is not a fleeting sprint, but a pilgrimage marked by divine encounters and human stumbles. A road that winds through valleys of doubt and peaks of trust, a path of light and shadow that tests the heart. Abraham's story teaches that faith is not the absence of questions, but the courage to trust despite the trembling, to hold fast when the heart quakes, to stand firm when the world shakes, to endure when the night is long. The scriptures remind us, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up, Galatians 6:9. Abraham's altars, built in the shadow of uncertainty, were not mere piles of stone. They were declarations that God's promises endure. Even when the heart quivers with doubt, even when the promise seems a distant star, a light barely glimpsed, a hope deferred, a dream on the horizon. Yet the story does not pause here. The same God who promised a son revealed a sobering truth: Sodom and Gomorrah, cities steeped in wickedness, their streets choked with violence and depravity, their air heavy with the stench of sin, faced the judgment of heaven. A reckoning long foretold, a day of divine wrath. The air grew heavy as the Lord spoke, the scent of dust and distant smoke lingering like a portent of doom. A warning carried on the wind, a shadow of retribution that darkened the sky. Abraham, once a man who fled to Egypt in fear, now stood as an intercessor, his heart transformed by the call, his spirit lifted by grace, his soul refined by trial, his faith tempered by fire. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He pleaded, Genesis 18:23. His voice trembling not with arrogance, but with a deep trust in God's mercy. A trust forged in the fires of his own trials, a faith that had been refined in the desert, a hope that endured the storm. Abraham's intercession was bold, persistent, a dance of faith before the throne of grace, a prayer that rose like incense, a fragrance of devotion that filled the air. What if there are 50 righteous people, 40-30, 20-10, Genesis 18:24-32? Each question was a step deeper into the heart of God, a reflection of the truth that mercy triumphs over judgment, James 2:13, a truth that echoed through the ages, a melody of compassion that soothed the soul. Though Sodom's sin was a stain upon the earth, a mark of rebellion against the divine order, a scar upon creation, Abraham's prayer revealed a profound calling. Faith does not merely receive blessings, it pleads for the broken. It stands in the gap when hope seems lost. It lifts its voice when silence threatens to prevail. It intercedes when all seems hopeless. It cries out in the wilderness. The desert night was cool, the stars above burning with a clarity that seemed to amplify his words. The scent of sage in the distant crackle of a fire grounding the moment, as if the earth itself bore witness to a single man's cry, a solitary figure against the vastness, a voice in the wilderness that shook the heavens. Who are you called to intercede for? To plead for mercy when the world cries for judgment, to stand as a light in the gathering dark, a beacon amid the storm, a hope in the night, a refuge for the lost. The weight of Sodom's fate lingered in the air, a somber reminder that God's justice is as real as his mercy, a balance that upholds the order of creation, a harmony of righteousness and grace that governs the cosmos. Yet Abraham's prayer was not in vain. A seed planted in the soil of grace, a root that bore fruit in the desert. The Lord spared Lot and his family, dragging them from the city before judgment fell in a rain of fire and sulfur. A deliverance born of compassion, a hand of salvation that reached into the flames, Genesis 19:16. The desert, with its endless sands and fleeting shadows, bore witness to this truth: God hears the cries of the righteous. Even when the world is deaf to their pleas, even when the night is thick with despair, even when the heart is heavy with burden. The scent of smoke and ash drifted across the plains, a bitter fragrance that spoke of sin's cost, yet also of mercy's reach, a hand extended even in the midst of wrath, a promise fulfilled in the midst of ruin, a light in the darkness that pierced the gloom. The scriptures teach, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective, James 5:16. When have you stood in the gap for another, trusting God's mercy to prevail where human hope falters, where the heart is heavy with doubt, where the spirit is weary, where the night is long? Abraham's journey was a tapestry of faith and failure, of altars raised in the wilderness and detours carved by fear. A woven story of light and shadow, a fabric of grace that clothed the soul. Each step was a lesson in surrender. Each trial a refining fire that burned away the dross of self-reliance, a purification of the soul, a cleansing of the heart that prepared him for glory. The desert had shaped him, its harsh beauty a mirror of his soul, its sands a testament to the Almighty's faithfulness, a canvas where the divine hand painted hope. a masterpiece of redemption that spoke of love, the scent of sagebrush and cedar smoke, the cool touch of starlit nights, the weight of unfulfilled promises. These were the threads that wove his story, a narrative of a man who stumbled yet rose, who doubted yet believed, who feared yet trusted, who fell yet was lifted, who wept yet rejoiced. The Apostle Paul reminds us, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. 1 Corinthians chapter 10:13. How has God's faithfulness carried you through trials you thought would shatter your spirit? A burden too great for human strength, a weight that crushed the soul, a storm that threatened to overwhelm. Yet the story of Abraham is more than a recounting of ancient days. It is a living call to every heart that hears the whisper of the divine, a summons that echoes through the ages, a voice that pierces the silence, a cry that awakens the spirit, the desert of waiting, the altars of surrender, the laughter of disbelief. These are not foreign to us. They are the terrain of faith, the ground where trust is forged in the furnace of adversity, where the soul is tested and the spirit is reborn, where the human meets the divine in a dance of grace, where the eternal touches the temporal with a gentle hand. The God who called Abraham calls us still, not to a path of ease, but to a legacy of obedience, a heritage of trust that spans generations, a covenant that endures beyond the stars. He is the God who sees the trembling soul, who hears the silent cry in the night, who provides when all seems lost, a shepherd in the wilderness, a light in the storm, a refuge in the tempest. And he is not finished with us yet, a promise that endures beyond the stars, a hope that outlasts the ages, a love that never fails. As we pause at this midpoint, reflect on your own journey. Where has God called you to leave the familiar, to step into the unknown with trembling hands? A heart unsure yet willing, a spirit open to grace, a soul ready to trust. What promises have you laughed at, fearing they are too late, too distant to hold? A dream that fades with the dawn, a hope that wavers, a vision that eludes the grasp. Whom are you called to intercede for, to stand in the gap when hope seems a fading ember, a light dimmed by the storm, a flame that flickers in the wind, a spark that needs rekindling? The story of Abraham teaches us that faith is not the absence of questions, but the courage to keep walking, to keep building altars, to keep trusting, even when the promise seems a shadow on the horizon, a whisper in the wind, a vision in the mist, a hope deferred. The desert is not your end, it is your beginning. A sacred space where the soul is refined and the spirit is reborn, where the divine meets the human in a dance of grace, where the eternal touches the temporal with a kiss of light. Can a father's love be tested by the blade of divine command? A sacrifice that rends the soul with every anguished breath, a wound that cuts to the core of being and leaves a scar unseen, a mark of devotion. What if the promise of a future hung upon the altar of surrender? A son offered to the unknown depths of faith where shadows dwell and silence reigns supreme over the heart. A realm of mystery. Does faith demand the surrender of all we cherish? Even the laughter born of barren hope that once seemed lost to the winds of despair and the dust of forgotten years. A joy reclaimed. Why does the Almighty call us to the mountain of sacrifice, where trust is forged in the fire of loss and the shadow of death looms large over the heart, casting a pall of dread that chills the spirit? A test of will is the ultimate proof of belief, found not in receiving the gifts bestowed by grace, but in releasing what we hold most dear with trembling. Broken hands that seek the divine in the darkness of the soul. A surrender of love. These mysteries linger like the echo of a distant horn, reverberating through the silence with a haunting resonance, drawing us deeper into the shadow path of Abraham. A journey veiled in the mists of time and etched with the scars of faith that mark the faithful. A pilgrimage of the spirit. His story unfolds as a sacred testament, where faith is refined in the crucible of obedience and grace prevails over the abyss of despair. A narrative etched in eternity with the ink of sacrifice. A tale woven with threads of hope that bind the ages. A fabric of redemption. The air grew heavy with an unspoken dread as the dawn broke over the rugged peaks of Moriah, a mountain shrouded in mist where the divine and the human converged in a dance of destiny, a meeting of heaven and earth that trembled with purpose and pulsed with mystery, a convergence of will that shook the foundation. The scent of pine and rocky earth rose from the slopes, mingling with the faint tang of dew that clung to the stones, a fragrance both earthy and ethereal, a whisper of life amid the starkness that spoke of creation's resilience, a breath of hope in the wilderness that stirred the soul with longing, a hint of grace. The first light pierced the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the terrain, a prelude to the trial ahead, a foretaste of the sacrifice to come, a shadow of the cross that loomed in the distance, a silhouette of redemption that promised light. The wind carried a low moan, a sound that stirred the soul with both awe and fear, a lament that echoed through the valleys, a cry of the earth that mourned. As Abraham stood at the base, his gaze fixed upward, where the summit loomed like a silent judge, its craggy outline a testament to endurance, a sentinel of faith that watched over the land with unblinking eyes, a guardian of the covenant that stood firm. The voice had come again in the stillness of the night, a command that pierced the fabric of his dreams with a sharpness that cut deep into his spirit, a call that reverberated in the chambers of his heart with a thunderous roar. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you. Genesis 22:2. The words were a thunderbolt, striking at the core of his being with a force that left him breathless. A test that shook the foundations of his faith with a power that defied comprehension. A summons that echoed in the silence of his soul with a weight that crushed. A burden that overwhelmed. Isaac, the child of laughter, the fulfillment of a promise long delayed. The joy born from Sarah's barren womb now stood as the offering demanded by the God who had given him. A paradox that tore at his heart with every beat, a mystery that confounded his mind with its depth, a riddle that defied. The weight of the command pressed against Abraham's chest, each breath a struggle between love and obedience, a battle waged in the silence of his soul, a war between the heart's cry and the divine will, a conflict that raged within, a storm that threatened to break him, a tempest that tested his resolve, a trial that refined, a fire that purified. What stirs within you when the voice of God calls you to surrender the one you love most? A gift you cannot bear to lose, a treasure that defines your hope, a light in your darkness that guides your steps through the night, a beacon in the storm that steadies your soul. The journey to Moriah was a pilgrimage of the heart, each step a descent into the abyss of trust, a march toward the unknown with a burden unseen, a path paved with sacrifice and shadowed by doubt, a road of tears that wound through the wilderness, a trail of sorrow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky path, the crunch of gravel underfoot a steady rhythm that marked the passage of time, a metronome of fate that counted down the moments, a pulse of destiny that beat in his ears with a relentless cadence, a drum of doom. Isaac walked beside him, his youthful voice breaking the silence with innocent questions, unaware of the burden his father carried. A child's trust that pierced the veil of Abraham's resolve with a purity that cut deep, an innocence that challenged his faith with every word, a light that shone in the gloom. The air carried the scent of wild thyme and the distant bleat of sheep, a pastoral melody that contrasted with the storm within Abraham's spirit, a harmony of life amid the gathering darkness, a song of innocence amid the shadow, a whisper of peace that clashed with his turmoil, a breath of calm that warred with his fear. Two servants trailed behind, their presence a quiet witness to the unfolding drama, their footsteps a faint echo in the vastness, a reminder of the world left behind, a link to the past that faded with each step, a tether to the familiar that slipped away into the mist. Abraham's hands gripped the wood for the offering, the rough texture a reminder of the task ahead, a tactile connection to the sacrifice, a burden that weighed on his palms, while his mind wrestled with the paradox of a God who gives and then demands back. a mystery that defied understanding, a riddle that haunted his thoughts with every breath, a puzzle that defied solution, a question that lingered in the silence. The promise of a nation rested in Isaac, the seed of a covenant, the hope of a lineage that would bless the earth, the foundation of a people. Yet the command to sacrifice him loomed as a contradiction, a test that challenged the very core of his belief, a trial that tested his soul to its depths, a crucible that refined his spirit, a fire that purified, a forge that shaped. Each rise of the trail brought him closer to the altar, closer to the moment when faith would be measured not by words, but by the knife in his hand, a moment that hung like a sword over his heart, a shadow that darkened his path, a burden that weighed on his spirit, a cross he bore in silence, a load he carried alone, a weight that pressed. The scriptures affirm, "The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him, and he helps me," Psalm 28:7. Yet how often do we falter when strength is tested by the sacrifice of what we hold dear? When the shield seems to tremble, when the heart quakes under the weight of the call, when the soul bends beneath the load, when the spirit wavers in the storm, when the faith falters. As they ascended, Isaac's voice broke through the tension, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade of innocence, a cry that pierced the veil with a child's purity, a question that echoed through the heights. "The fire and wood are here," he said, his tone curious yet trusting. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Genesis 22:7. The question hung in the air, a child's innocence piercing the veil of Abraham's resolve, a query that struck at the heart of his secret, a cry that echoed in the void, a challenge to his faith that reverberated in the stillness, a plea that stirred the depths. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine needles and the faint rustle of leaves, grounding him in the moment. Yet his heart quaked with the weight of the truth he bore, a burden that bent his spirit, a load that pressed on his soul, a weight that crushed his resolve, a pain that lingered in the silence. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son," Abraham replied, his voice steady yet heavy with a faith he could scarcely grasp. A hope cast into the unknown, a prayer whispered to the heavens in the stillness, a plea that rose above the wind with desperate longing, Genesis 22:8. The words were a prophecy born of desperation, a lifeline thrown into the abyss, a trust that defied the evidence before his eyes, a belief that clung to the unseen with desperate hands, a faith that reached beyond the seen with outstretched arms, a hope that soared. Isaac's trusting eyes met his, and the bond between father and son deepened the agony. A love that made the command unbearable, a love that compelled obedience, a tie that bound them in the shadow of the altar, a connection that tested the limits of devotion, a bond that stretched to the breaking point, a thread that held against the storm, a cord that endured. The servants remained below as Abraham and Isaac climbed the final ascent. The summit now a solitary stage for the divine test, where the air grew thin and the silence profound, a space where heaven and earth met in tension, a place of ultimate surrender, a crucible of the soul, a furnace of faith, an altar of grace, a sanctuary of trust. The peak of Moriah revealed a landscape both stark and sacred, a theater of the soul's struggle, a stage for the drama of faith that unfolded in silence, a canvas of divine will that painted the scene with bold strokes. The stones were weathered, their surfaces etched with the scars of time, reflecting the light of the rising sun in a golden hue that bathed the summit in warmth. A glow of hope amid the trial, a light that pierced the gloom with its radiance, a dawn of promise that broke the night. The scent of dry earth and the distant cry of a hawk filled the air, a wild symphony that underscored the gravity of the moment, a call of the wild that echoed the divine call, a voice of nature in harmony with the divine voice, a song of creation that sang of eternity, a hymn of the heavens that lifted the spirit. The wind whispered through the crags, a soft lament that stirred the senses, a breath of the eternal amid the temporal, a sigh of the ages that carried the weight of history, a murmur of the past that spoke of endurance, a breath of the future. Abraham built the altar with trembling hands, each stone placed with care, a structure that would hold his son's life, a monument to obedience that rose from the earth, a testament to trust that stood tall against the wind, a pillar of faith. He bound Isaac, the boy's body still and trusting, his breath a soft rhythm against the wood, a pulse of life that beat in contrast to the deathly task, a heartbeat that spoke of innocence, a life offered in faith, a gift laid bare before the divine, a sacrifice of love. The knife gleamed in his hand, its edge a symbol of surrender, and for a heartbeat. The world paused, the universe holding its breath, the stars themselves seeming to watch, the heavens awaiting the outcome, the earth standing still in awe, the cosmos in suspense. The love for his son warred with the call of God, a conflict that tore at his spirit. Yet faith held him firm, an anchor in the storm, a rock in the tempest, a foundation that stood against the tide, a pillar of hope that endured. As he raised the blade, a voice thundered from the heavens, Abraham. Abraham, Genesis 22:11. The angel of the Lord stayed his hand, declaring, "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son," Genesis 22:12. In the thicket, a ram appeared, its horns caught, a provision divine and unexpected, a substitute for the sacrifice, a gift from the unseen, a mercy unearned that lifted the burden, a grace that flowed like a river, a salvation that redeemed. What strength do you summon when asked to lay your greatest treasure upon the altar? Trusting the unseen to provide, to meet you in the moment of despair, to lift you from the abyss, to carry you through the night, to guide you to the dawn, to lead you to the light, to bring you to the promise. The ram's bleat broke the silence, a sound of deliverance that echoed across the mountain, a cry of life that shattered the tension, a proclamation of grace that filled the air with hope, a trumpet of salvation that rang. The air grew lighter as Abraham unbound Isaac, the boy's eyes wide with wonder, his breath a sigh of relief, a gasp of grace that filled the space, a breath of hope that lifted the soul, a whisper of peace that calmed the storm. The scent of burning sacrifice soon rose, the ram's offering a fragrant ascent to the Lord, a testament to faith fulfilled, a perfume of obedience that filled the air, a fragrance of redemption that lingered in the soul, an aroma of mercy that soothed the heart, a balm for the weary. The moment was a revelation, a glimpse into the heart of God, where mercy triumphs over demand, where love prevails over judgment, where grace outshines the law, where compassion meets the cry, where forgiveness heals the wound, where hope dawns, where peace reigns. The Lord renewed his promise with a voice that resonated through the peaks, a declaration that shook the earth with its power. "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore," Genesis 22:17. The words were a balm, a reaffirmation of covenant, a promise sealed in the fire of obedience, a vow that echoed in the silence, a light that pierced the darkness, a hope that endured, a strength that sustained, a joy that overflowed, a love that bound. Abraham named the place, "The Lord will provide," Genesis 22:14, a memorial etched in stone and memory, a marker of divine faithfulness amid human trial, a signpost for generations to come, a beacon of hope that guided the faithful, a light in the wilderness, a lamp for the lost, a star for the weary. The writer of Hebrews reflects, "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead," Hebrews 11:17. What dead hopes might God resurrect if you trust him with your deepest fears, if you release your grip on the past, if you open your hands to the future, if you surrender to the divine will, if you believe in the impossible, if you hope against hope, if you stand in faith. The descent from Moriah was a journey transformed, a pilgrimage of redemption that lightened the soul with every step, a path of grace that lifted the heart with each breath, a road of mercy that healed. The path, once heavy with dread, now bore the lightness of deliverance, a road paved with grace, a highway of hope that stretched to the horizon, a trail of light that shone with promise. The sun cast a golden glow over the slopes, the air filled with the scent of pine and the distant murmur of streams. harmony of life restored, a symphony of hope that sang through the trees, a melody of peace that soothed the spirit, a song of joy that lifted the heart, a hymn of love. Isaac walked beside his father, their bond deepened by the shared ordeal, a silent understanding that transcended words, a connection forged in the fire of faith, a tie that bound them beyond the flesh, a love that endured the trial, a unity that strengthened, a bond that grew. The servants rejoined them, their faces reflecting awe at the tale they would carry home, a story of miracle and mercy that would be told by the fireside, a narrative of grace that would inspire the ages, a testament of trust that would endure. Yet within Abraham, the memory of the knife lingered, a scar upon his soul, a reminder of the cost of faith, a wound that spoke of love and trust, a mark of surrender that etched itself into his being, a testament to his obedience, a seal of devotion, a sign of grace, the promise of a nation. Once a distant dream, now felt tangible, its roots planted in the soil of Moriah, watered by tears and trust, nurtured by obedience, a seed that would grow into a mighty tree, a forest of faith that spread across the land, a grove of hope that flourished. The story of Moriah foreshadows a greater sacrifice, a shadow cast across the ages, a prefigurement of divine love that resonates through time with a timeless echo, a promise fulfilled with a resounding chord. Centuries later, on a hill called Calvary, another father offered his only son, not with a ram in the thicket, but with a cross of wood that bore the weight of sin, a burden beyond measure, a load that crushed the innocent, a price paid in blood that redeemed the world, a gift of love. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, John 3:16. The scriptures proclaim, revealing the depth of divine love, a love that surpasses understanding, a love that redeems the lost, a love that conquers death, a love that heals the broken, a love that restores, a love that saves. Abraham's act was a shadow of this truth, a type of the Christ to come, a prefigurement of the Lamb who would take away the sin of the world, a sacrifice that would echo through eternity, a gift that would heal the nations, a redemption that would span the ages, a salvation that endures, a light that shines. The mountain of Moriah became a sacred echo, its stones whispering of a redemption to come, a promise fulfilled in the blood of the Lamb, a hope realized in the resurrection, a light that dawned over the earth, a dawn that broke. The air around the summit seemed to hold the memory of that future day, a breeze that carried the scent of sacrifice and salvation, a wind that spoke of grace, a breath that promised life, a whisper of eternity, a sigh of peace, a breath of hope. What part of your heart is God asking you to surrender? Trusting that his provision will exceed your sacrifice, that his love will outlast your pain, that his grace will heal your wounds, that his mercy will restore your soul, that his light will guide your path, that his hope will lift your spirit, that his peace will calm your storm. Abraham's life did not end on Moriah. It rippled through time, a legacy of faith that shaped nations and touched the eternal with a gentle hand that guided the lost through the wilderness, a touch that healed, a hand that lifted. The years that followed were marked by quiet obedience, the building of wells that quenched thirst in the desert, the raising of altars that spoke of trust amid the sands, the nurturing of a family that carried the promise into the future, a lineage of hope that stretched to the stars, a chain of grace that bound the faithful. The desert remained his home, its sands a canvas for the unfolding story, its vastness a mirror of his journey, a reflection of his soul's pilgrimage, a testament to his endurance, a record of his faith, a testament to his love, a chronicle of grace. The scent of sagebrush in the cool touch of night air became familiar, a backdrop to a life lived in trust, a fragrance of perseverance that lingered in the air, a perfume of faith that filled the lungs, a breath of devotion that inspired. Sarah bore Isaac, and the laughter of fulfillment filled their tent, a sound that banished the silence of barren years, a melody that danced in the air, a song of joy that echoed through the ages, a hymn of grace that lifted the heart. a chorus of hope that sang. Yet Abraham's gaze often turned to the stars, a reminder of the covenant that stretched beyond his lifetime, a promise that would find its ultimate fulfillment in the Messiah, a hope that spanned the ages, a light that guided the night, a beacon for the faithful, a star that shone, a guide for the lost, a light that endured. The Apostle Paul writes, "Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham." Romans 4:16, how does your faith connect you to this ancient promise? A heritage of grace that binds the faithful across time, a covenant that unites the generations, a bond that endures, a thread that weaves, a chain that holds, a cord that strengthens. Abraham's death came in old age, his body weary, but his spirit at peace, a soul at rest in the arms of the divine, a heart stilled by faith, a life completed with honor, a journey fulfilled with joy. The desert winds carried his story to his children, a tale of a man who trusted when all seemed lost, who obeyed when the cost was unbearable, who interceded when others faltered, who surrendered when the heart cried out, who persevered when the path was dark, who hoped when the night was long, who believed when the dawn was distant, who loved when the world was cold, who gave when the need was great. His burial in the cave of Machpelah beside Sarah was a quiet end to a life of loud faith, a resting place carved from the earth, a sanctuary of memory that held his legacy, a tomb of triumph that spoke of victory, a haven of peace. The air around the tomb was heavy with the scent of earth and the faint whisper of olive leaves. A place of rest that spoke of a journey completed, a haven where the soul found peace, a refuge for the weary, a shelter for the faithful, a home for the hopeful, a nest for the redeemed. The stones of the cave echoed with the legacy he left, a heritage of trust that endured, a testament to a life well lived, a monument to faith that stood tall, a pillar of hope that rose, a beacon of light, yet his story lived on. A flame passed to Isaac, to Jacob, to a nation, and beyond to all who walk by faith, a light that never fades, a beacon that guides, a torch that illuminates, a fire that warms, a star that shines, a sun that rises. Jesus himself honored Abraham, saying, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad," John 8:56. Through the eyes of faith, Abraham glimpsed the coming Savior, a vision that sustained him through the trials, a hope that anchored his soul, a promise that lit his path, a dream that carried him forward, a light that shone, a guide that led, a star that guided. His life became a map for believers, a guide through the deserts of doubt, a call to trust in the God who provides, a path that leads to eternal light, a road that beckons with grace, a trail that promises glory, a way that endures, a journey that inspires, a pilgrimage that transforms. The writer of Hebrews places him in the hall of faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Hebrews 11:8. His steps from Ur to Moriah were a pilgrimage of trust, a journey that invites us to follow, a road that beckons with promise, a path that leads to the divine, a way that shines with hope, a trail that guides, a road that redeems. Where is God calling you to walk by faith, to trust beyond sight, to build a legacy that outlasts your days, to leave a mark upon the earth, to sow seeds for the harvest, to plant hope in the wilderness, to nurture faith in the barren, to cultivate love in the desert, to spread grace in the silence? In a world that craves certainty, Abraham's story stands as a challenge, a beacon in the night that pierces the gloom with its light, a star that guides the lost through the darkness. The desert, with its shifting sands and relentless sun, mirrors our own struggles, waiting in silence, doubting in the dark, fearing the unknown, trembling at the edge of the abyss, faltering in the storm, wavering in the wind, questioning in the shadow. Yet it also holds the promise of provision. The ram in the thicket, the voice that stays the hand, the grace that lifts the burden, the mercy that heals, the love that restores, the hope that endures, the faith that triumphs, the peace that calms, the scent of sacrifice, the coolness of starlit nights, the weight of obedience. These are the threads of a narrative that calls us to deeper faith, a story that weaves hope into despair, a tale that binds the broken, a song that lifts the fallen, a hymn that soothes, a melody that heals, a chorus that inspires. Abraham's altars, built in uncertainty, became monuments of trust. Their stones a witness to a God who sees and provides, a testimony to a love that endures, a declaration of hope that rises above the sand, a proclamation of grace that echoes through the ages. The scriptures urge, be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Revelation 2:10. What faithfulness is God asking of you today? A commitment that echoes Abraham's courage, a dedication that withstands the storm, a resolve that faces the night, a trust that endures the trial, a faith that overcomes, a hope that prevails, a love that perseveres. Abraham's intercession for Sodom and his obedience on Moriah reveal a faith that extends beyond self, a love that reaches out to the lost with open arms, a compassion that pleads for mercy with a fervent cry. He stood in the gap for others, pleaded for mercy when judgment loomed, and offered his son in trust when the heart cried out, a sacrifice of the spirit that spoke of devotion, a gift of the soul that sang of grace, an offering of the heart. This is the heart of his legacy, a faith that blesses, that prays, that surrenders, that intercedes for the broken, that lifts the fallen, that seeks the lost, that heals the wounded, that restores the weary, that comforts the afflicted. The desert, once a place of trial, became a sanctuary of revelation, where God's character was unveiled as both just and merciful, a duality that sustains us still, a balance that guides our steps, a harmony that soothes the soul, a rhythm that calms the heart, a melody that lifts, a song that saves, a hymn that redeems. The air of Moriah, once heavy with dread, now carried the fragrance of redemption, a scent that lingered in the memory of the faithful, a perfume of grace that filled the lungs, a breath of hope that inspired, a whisper of eternity that comforted, a sigh of peace that healed. Today, we face our own Moriah's sacrifices of dreams that fade into the mist, relationships that strain under the weight of time, security that slips away like sand through the fingers, hopes that wither in the sun, joys that dim in the shadow, loves that falter in the storm, promises that waver, the call to leave comfort, to trust in the unseen, to intercede for the lost. Echoes Abraham's path, a summons that resonates in the soul, a voice that calls in the wilderness, a cry that awakens the spirit, a plea that stirs the heart, a command that lifts, a word that guides. The stars above, the sands below, the silence within, they invite us to believe, to step forward, to offer what we hold dear with open hands, to trust with unwavering hearts, to hope with steadfast spirits, to love with fervent souls, to live with faithful steps. Abraham's story is not an end, but a beginning, a map for our journey, a reminder that the Lord will provide. Genesis 22:14, not just on Moriah, but in every desert we traverse, in every trial we face, in every moment of surrender, in every hour of need, in every dawn of hope, in every night of faith, in every day of grace, in every season of trust. What sacrifice is God asking you to place on the altar, trusting His provision to meet you in the moment of surrender, to lift you in the hour of need, to guide you through the night, to carry you to the dawn, to lead you to the light, to bring you to the promise, to restore your joy, to heal your pain? As we reflect, consider the altars you build. Are they monuments of trust that rise above the sand, or relics of doubt that crumble in the wind, fragments of fear that scatter in the storm, shards of unbelief that break apart, ruins of despair? Abraham's faith was not perfect, a flawless diamond untouched by flaw, but it was persistent, a flame that burned through fear, a light that guided through darkness, a fire that warmed the cold, a beacon that shone, a lamp that lit the way, a torch that blazed, a star that glowed, a sun that rose. The God who met him on Moriah meets us now, calling us to walk, to wait, to intercede, to surrender with open hands, to trust with unwavering heart, to hope with steadfast spirit, to believe with fervent soul, to love with endless grace, to live with eternal faith. His faithfulness is our shield, his promise our reward, a covenant that endures beyond the stars, a love that outlasts the ages, a grace that never fails, a mercy that never wanes, a light that never dims, a hope that never fades, a peace that surpasses. The mountain of sacrifice becomes a place of provision, the desert a field of hope, the silence a song of grace, the night a canvas of light, the trial a path to triumph, the surrender a gateway to glory, the faith a bridge to eternity, the love a bond to heaven. The journey continues beyond Abraham, a story woven into ours, a tapestry of faith that binds the generations, a thread that connects the past to the future, a cord that unites the faithful, a chain of grace that links the ages, a rope of hope. Where will your steps of faith lead? What legacy will you leave? What prayers will you offer? What sacrifices will you make? What altars will you raise? What hopes will you plant? What dreams will you nurture? What loves will you share? What trusts will you build? The desert is not your end, it is your beginning. A sacred space where the soul is refined and the spirit is reborn. Where the divine hand shapes a destiny of eternal hope. Where the eternal light breaks through the temporal night. Where the promise finds its fulfillment. Where the heart finds its home. Where the faithful find their rest. Where the lost find their Savior. Where the broken find their healing.